I'm Jeremy Parish, Media Curator at Limited Run Games.
Can you talk about how this project came into being?
This is an adaptation of a video series that I've been producing for years and years called NES Works, just like the book, and really a chronology of the NES. I've also, dabbled in some other systems as well, but NES is kind of the main focus that I started in, October 1985 with the launch games, and I'm at the end of 1988 at this point. Once I get to the end of the year, I start pulling together the scripts, revising them, refining them, adding additional content like sidebars and supplemental articles and things like that, taking the direct high definition feed that I use for the video and grabbing screenshots from those, including photography of all the packaging, box fronts, backs, manuals, cartridges, peripherals, etc. Really, the aim here is to create as comprehensive and complete an analysis and overview of the 1987 NES library as possible, and to provide not just, game reviews, but also to look at the context of what these games, kind of where they existed in time. What were the influences on these games? What other games were they competing with? What other systems were they competing with? How do all of these things funnel together and feed into each other? And, what was popular culture like and American history like at that point? To really just kind of cast people back in time 35 years to help them to understand why when we sat down to play some of these games like Rygar or the Goonies 2, it was like, wow, this is really cool. This is amazing. I've never seen anything like this on my television before. And that's hard to convey now in the age of 4K and HD and that sort of thing. But, for those of us who were there, it had a huge impact, I think. And I want to convey that.
So speaking of that, Jeremy, what are your plans with other projects like this? This is focused on primarily Nintendo. And what do you plan to accomplish as a printing house?
Well, that's two separate questions. So I'll start with the NES Works question. Yeah, so like I said, I am working my way through the NES chronology, but I've also published a book on the first year of Super NES releases, a complete look at Virtual Boy. Those are available currently. I've done some Game Boy related books that are out of print at the moment, but I hope to get those back into print. I said I'm almost done with 1988. I've got 2 more video scripts to write, and then I'm done with 88. So, then I'll start working on a book on those. But before that, I'm actually going to jump into Sega's history. And last year into this year, I devoted a lot of time putting together a video chronology of the Sega SG-1000, which was their 8-bit system that preceded the Master System. Never was released in America, but there's a lot of really significant and important things that happened on that system, and really understanding that system kind of helps you understand how Sega went from being this arcade powerhouse in the early 80s that had never produced anything for homes before to being, one of the major powers of console gaming 10 years later, especially with the Genesis. So SG-1000, it's called Segaiden because it's a side story to the NES Works. That book is pretty well underway. My hope is to launch it right around the 40th anniversary of the system next July. And alongside that, I'd also like to have a book on the Famicom's launch, the Japanese NES, and all the games that were published for that system leading up to the NES launch, because a lot of those are, I think, important to understanding the NES as well. So yeah, the SG-1000 book is kind of my first foray into a book outside of Nintendo, but next year I'm going to be producing a video series on the Master System and bringing that chronology up in line with NES Works, so to the end of 1988, and then from there I'll cover both. So I really want to kind of expand, and I've got coverage of other systems in the work, but I can only do so much at a time. This is really all stuff that I do on the side, not on the clock at Limited Run.
Not your day to day, yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of side material that feeds into my work at Limited Run, which gets us to the second part of your question. What do we want to do with this printing label? So far we've mostly printed books that I've produced just because, hey, I'm here, I do this. I've been putting together books for self-publishing for more than a decade. So it's an easy place to kind of start and build up a little bit of a library. But beginning, in March of next year, We've already published one book by another author, The History of Sunsoft by Stefan Ganser. Starting, next spring, our hope is to publish a book per month that will often, most of the time, not be by me. I mean, I'm involved with these books, editing, sometimes doing the design and layout, offering feedback to authors, getting things through to publishers and, kind of overseeing their launch on the limited run store and getting them hopefully into places like Amazon and so forth. But the goal is really for us to create a home for great books about video games, not just video game history, but video games, video game culture, video game design, personal memoirs about video games, all sorts of video game coverage that, maybe they don't have the mass appeal to be something like Console Wars or whatever, where it's going to be picked up by a major imprint and sell 100,000 copies. But these books are good, and they're by talented authors and cover a lot of, provide a lot of great information, and they deserve better than to be, print on demand, lost in the shuffle, in the back end of Amazon or some other self-publishing house, or, sold at conventions only. They need, a little more love and care than that, and to go through a proper printing process and be printed in high quality book form and to have marketing behind them. Really, it's about making sure that the people who are creating these books, it's worth their time to do it, and that it encourages them to do it more often and to create more great books about video games. And at the same time to reach out to, limited runs audience and other audiences to interest them in books about video games. And, whether they do that, pick these books up as collectibles or as things that they're genuinely interested in reading, I hope it's something that they enjoy and that, maybe even learn something from, and maybe it will inspire them to some degree.
You mentioned another writer you work with. Can you talk about other writers you work with on other projects, and how do you go about choosing those writers?
So for the most part, we've kind of been working with authors that we know, people, who we know are creating books or are interested in creating books, people who have experience and, a great background in writing or in the games industry. At some point, hopefully we'll get this whole system up and running so we can open up solicitations. So anyone who may not have a rock solid background, but has a lot of talent and a lot of enthusiasm, will be able to publish through us. But there's just two of us, myself and Jared Petty, who are handling all these books, plus doing other limited run related responsibilities. So it's, it's time consuming to bring a book to press. It's not just like someone sends us a manuscript and we throw it into a Word document and hand it to the printers. Like we're really working closely hand in hand with our authors to, polish up their text, to, give them feedback and say, hey, this part seems extraneous, or this is really interesting, but could you expand on it? Or, hey, the way you've kind of phrased everything here is a little bit repetitive. Could you go back in and mix up some of the way you're writing and use more varied language? Both kind of high level feedback and also very specific mechanical, grammatical editing, things like that. So, that's time consuming. Hit the brakes a little bit and not go too fast, but I'm hoping, maybe someday before too long, this will be very successful and we'll be able to go to the company and say, hey, look, we're bringing in lots of traffic, lots of sales. People are buying books. We want to do more books. Please give us more people to help make more books. The authors we're working with that I can talk about right now, who have, projects in development, are people who have a varying degrees of experience in games journalism and game development. Right now I'm doing final edits on a book called It's Not All Fun and Games by Mark Flitman, who was a producer at Konami, Mindscape, Acclaim, Midway, Atari. He worked at all these companies through the late 80s, 90s, all the way into the 2000s, and has been involved with tons of licensed games from The Simpsons to WWF or WWE, Spider-Man, so forth. And he just sat down and, over the past decade, I think he's been working on this memoir. So our goal, and what I've been doing a lot of over the past year or so, has been to help get that into final form. And so once we finish this final round of feedback and edits, we'll start laying it out, and that's supposed to launch in May, June, sometime around then. I think it's going to be a great book. Like, it was really interesting to see his perspectives on what it was like to work at Konami in the 1980s, when it was, the American arm of this Japanese company that was incredibly successful at the height of like the Japanese bubble economy. That's really interesting stuff. Great historical perspective. And he talks also about, his childhood experiences and the stuff he did in college that fed into his interests and that he brought forward into the work that he did on games. So that's one book we're doing. Kevin Bunch, a game historian, has put together a very comprehensive retrospective on the first 2 years of the Atari 2600. He's spoken to developers and engineers who worked on the system. So it's going to be very similar in kind of the layout and look to the NES Works that I've published, but it's, on an older topic, going back to the 1970s, 77, 78, and really kind of digging into newspaper archives and trying to put together a comprehensive and definitive history of the Atari 2600's launch. Chris Kohler's working with us. Let's see, who else? Brian Clark, who is a translator, is putting together a book on video games featuring Japanese music stars, rock bands and things like that. There's a whole bunch of other projects in the works. Like, we've got a lineup that'll take us pretty much to the end of 2024 if we do a monthly release. Contracted so far, and those are in varying states of completion, but there's a whole lot on my plate and Jared's plate that we just need to sit down and edit and pull together, and then get into final print. But I'm excited to see these come together. Like, a year from now, we have a bookshelf out in the hall outside my office that is just dedicated to our publications. And by the end of next year, that's going to be full of our books. And I've already, put in an order for another bookshelf to go next to it, because I know we'll just keep publishing books and they're going to be great, and it'll just kind of build out the library. So I love to see this lineup expand and grow.
You talked about it a little bit, but can you go into more detail about some of the challenges you ran into while trying to research and vet stories about a Nintendo project like Zelda?
I feel like when I'm dealing with the Nintendo Entertainment System, that system's history is pretty well documented. So I haven't really encountered too much trouble finding historical information. With, the Sega SG-1000, that was much more challenging. That's just not documented in English very well. So when I put together the video series, there was a lot of guesswork involved and me reading different resources and trying to piece together information. And, since those videos have been produced, a lot of other information has been dug up by people who are kind of inspired by those videos to say, I don't know if that's right, so let's go find some hard facts. And we've actually dug up more concrete information about the series' release history and the order in which games were published than Sega makes available. They just say, like, this game came out in 1983. And that's all the information they have officially. I reached out to Sega and was like, do you have more info? Like, you look at Nintendo stuff, they have an exact date, down to the day. And Sega just doesn't have that info on hand. But we, Gaming Alexandria, the research organization and library, did some digging through some old Japanese arcade-focused publications and managed to find where this magazine had actually put together lists of, when games appeared at retail for Famicom, for SG-1000, for the Epoch Super Cassette Vision, a bunch of these old systems. That info just didn't exist online, but they found it in a magazine that was scanned from 1984, 85, and I've been able to go back into the text of the Segaiden book and really do a lot of rewriting from the original video scripts that anchor things correctly and say, like, hey, this is how this actually happened, and I have a better understanding of it now than when I made the videos. So, I put together the videos and they get a decent amount of traffic on YouTube. I'm not breaking any records or anything. But I look at those as really kind of rough drafts for the books. The books are kind of where I want to make the definitive statement. So it's this, for me with these books that I'm creating, it's a really nice workflow because I put the information out there and people are, on YouTube, they're quick to tell you if you're wrong. So I'm kind of crowdsourcing my facts. When I get it wrong, that's fine. I go back in, and with the book script, I'm able to correct it and say, hey, this was wrong the first time around, but now I know. Yeah, it's very satisfying to kind of piece this sort of obscure, forgotten history together.
So you talk about some of the ways that Zelda for the NES created some of the best practices for future games.
Yeah, so if you look at Zelda, there's a lot to say about that game. Nintendo, as a first-party game creator, they were still kind of figuring things out to a great degree at that point. They didn't actually create their first few arcade games. They designed them, but then other people actually put them together. And then they kind of took that work and built off of it for some of their follow-up arcade games. And then, they reached out to a lot of external studios when they were getting started with the Famicom and developing those black box games that you saw on NES in the early days. Once they created Super Mario Brothers, I think that was the point at which they kind of said, hey, we got it, we figured it out. But at the same time, they also maxed out what the basic hardware was capable of. So they released a peripheral about 6 months later called the Famicom Disk System, and Zelda was a launch title for the disk system. And it took advantage of that new hardware, which had, it used disks instead of cartridges, which at the time had greater storage capacity than cards. And disks were rewritable, and the hardware had more work RAM, and it had extra sound capabilities. So they put together this game that really kind of set the stage, I think, for the Nintendo vibe. Like, you look at Nintendo games versus Sega, and Nintendo games tend to be a little more methodical, a little slower paced, less like an arcade experience and more of a play it at home and spend a lot of time with it experience. And the disc system really made that possible, and Zelda was the first real expression of that for them. They created this game that has, a huge, expansive, consistent overworld. It's persistent. It's got 9 dungeons hidden inside of it. There's a lot that you just have to spend time with the game to discover the secrets and figure out, where is this dungeon and how do I get through this dungeon? Why is this bad guy not attacking me? He's just grumbling. What does that mean? But I can't get past him. Yeah, it really kind of, I think, defined the style of game that we often associate with Nintendo now, which is to say a large, expansive adventure that you really just want to sit down and spend some time with. Of course, Nintendo makes action games as well. They would continue making action games, but I feel like their focus on the home gaming experience, whereas Sega was, still very much an arcade creator first and foremost, and then those games showed up on their consoles. That really kind of defines the difference between those two systems. And, the first Zelda didn't do everything perfectly. There's some clues and some secrets that are too obscure for their own good. But just that sense of grandeur. I mean, I remember playing it back when it was new. And they promoted it with this amazing ad campaign. They put it in a silver cartridge, and they had these very mysterious commercials. And they talked about how it was a never-ending adventure. And it really was unlike anything anyone had ever played on a game console before. It kind of leaned into the sort of game experience you could have on PCs, but it looked nicer, it moved faster, it had great music, which, at the time PCs weren't really capable of doing. They could give you depth, but not so much of the flash. Zelda gave you the depth and the flash. And at the same time, it's not like superficial flash. It really I really feel like the world design of Zelda, it exists, the visuals to kind of create a place for you. And, I think Nintendo recognizes that. And 30 years later, they went back to that for Breath of the Wild and basically said, hey, let's create a Zelda NES experience, but for the HD generation. And just kind of, had the same style of play that the original Zelda did, where they just sort of set you in a world and say, go for it, get a sword, go find stuff, have an adventure, kill things, find things, earn things, get stronger, go beat Ganon. Yeah, it really is for me like a very definitive Nintendo game.
Just how important was the gold cartridge from a historical marketing standpoint view from The Legend of Zelda and the NES at the time?
I mean, the gold cartridge really set Zelda apart. It was something that really stood out when you went to your friend's house and they had a Zelda cartridge. You knew because it was in that stack of gray cartridges and it was gold and it was just shiny and impressive. But even on the shelves, Zelda broke away from the kind of standard black box format where you had a black top and bottom and there was kind of an angled bit of text on it and some bitmap art. It broke away from that for the first time for a first party Nintendo game and just gave you this image of Link's shield basically. But then there was a cutout on the box where you could see the gold cartridge shining through. So it just created the impression of here's a premium product. Like this game is really special. It's all kind of external fluff and doesn't really reflect the game underneath. Like they could have done that with any game. But I really think they understood that this game was special and they really wanted to make it stand out. It was the first game to ship with the ability to save data onto the cartridge, which it took them about a year to figure that out. And they had to come up with special mapper chips and figure out how to make a battery work and stay within the cartridge and sustain your save memory. But it just all together was this great package. They bundled it with a huge manual. They gave you all kinds of pointers. It included a fold-out map that was mostly complete of the overworld, but then the top corners were left empty, and that's where the hardest stuff in the game is. So even though they were kind of laying the world out before you, there was also still this sense of, hey, this isn't everything. You need to go figure some of this out yourself. We're not telling you where all the dungeons are. We're not showing you what's up in these mysterious northern corners of the map. We're not showing you layouts for all the dungeons, just the first few. So, it was really great as kind of training wheels for this very different kind of game without necessarily making the whole thing a pushover. Like, I remember my friends, just hanging out before school in the schoolyard talking about how to get to level 5 or how to find the 7th dungeon, just trying to break the secrets down and sharing that information back and forth was really a part of the game experience. It was a different world where we didn't have wikis, we didn't have game facts, we didn't have social media, we didn't have YouTube walkthroughs. It was really just kind of, one kid would figure something out. And then for that day, he was the hero of the playground because he could help his friends beat that next part of the game that no one had figured out. So it was a social experience, which I think a lot of that is kind of lost now when you just put a ROM in an emulator and play Zelda. Like, what does that mean? It's a good game, but you miss that sense of discovery and that communal aspect.
The NES Works books focus on 1987. You've done work for 1986, at least in the past, but what years do you think will be up next? 1988?
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing this all chronologically. So next up will be 88. Once I bring Master System video coverage up even with the NES, where that is currently at the end of 88, then I'll move into 1989 and cover NES and Master System. And, 89, a lot of game systems were introduced that year. Game Boy, TurboGrafx 16, Genesis. So I need to figure out how to integrate those into the series without, killing myself. Like, that's a lot of work.
Yeah,
that
like
I could
each one of those could be its
myself.
own book in its own.
Yeah, I mean, they might be. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do, but I do feel like it's important to talk about those systems and the games that came out for them, because that's another kind of piece of the NES experience is that by the end of 1989, 1990, like, you had really cool games like Ninja Gaiden, Super Mario Brothers 3, Batman, really just like top tier NES games, but over on Genesis, there was some pretty cool stuff happening too. And it was, your heart started to stray a little bit. You looked at those 16-bit graphics and were like, Mario 3, that looks great. I love this game, but wish I could have those 16 bits of power. That was amazing stuff. So, I feel like seeing the games that were contemporaneous, contemporary releases to the best of the NES is important to kind of painting the bigger picture.
And you mentioned Mike Tyson's Punch-Out is also in this book, the 1987 book. Will you address, how deep are you going to go with that? Are you going to address the removal of Tyson from the game in the book, or just stick to the original game's viral success pre-internet era?
Yeah, so the Punch-Out feature in the book talks about the history of the game and, how it plays and everything, but it also talks about Tyson's role in it. It shows the letter that he included, saying never, always believe in yourself, never give up. But at the same time, it does talk about the troubles that he faced and kind of tries to break down some of that. And it talks about and it shows just the standard Punch-Out reissue with Mr. Dream. So there's a lot of comparison photography of different games that had multiple releases. Punch-Out is one of those. You had two different versions of that. With Zelda, you had the gold card and the gray card. Metroid came out with the kind of the silver box, but then also the player's choice box that was yellow and had a different label. So I tried to find as many of these games as I could and pull them all together to kind of show their evolution, show, the different kinds of packaging. This is not really a collector-oriented book in that it doesn't break down like, hey, what's the difference between Rev A and Rev B, or like what are some of the differences, like running changes in the manual or the in-game text. It's not that granular, but does kind of showcase the broad strokes of how these things work. This book also has photography of stadium events in it, like the complete package, which that game, even before the pandemic spike for retro game prices, that was selling for $20,000 or $30,000. And I just happened to have a friend, Steve Lynn, who was very generous and brought his game to a podcast recording session and let me photograph it. But I was able to put that next to its reissue, World Class Track Meet, so you can see what these two games are. But you can actually look at the packaging of stadium events and kind of see it as a three-dimensional object, which if it weren't for that photo session, I would never touch that game. I would probably never see that game myself. So there's things like that I've been fortunate to have, friends and compatriots who are very generous with their time and have great collections. There's a lot of photography of games in this book that originally, I don't know, the photos didn't turn out as well as I would have liked. So Chris Kohler allowed me to photograph his collection for a few games and get better photography in there. So even though this is a project that has been a free time thing for me and has been kind of start to finish created by me, it's still made possible by the contributions of lots of people. I want to kind of pay that forward with Press Run as the bigger publishing label and help people bring their projects to life and make things possible for them that might be difficult or prohibitively expensive or just otherwise unfeasible for them.
And speaking of that, you mentioned that you take photos of the game itself from your private collection as well as like contributors to that collection, but you've also done quite a bit of illustration in the past. How much custom artwork or illustration have you personally contributed to NES Works 1987 so far?
There's not really a lot of artwork per se in these books. I don't really draw much anymore. The collector's edition of the book, which comes in a slipcase and has an edition number 1 of 1,000 in it, does have some bonus artwork. There's a huge poster that has the slipcase cover artwork on it, 18 by 24 inch, I think, which is by Bill Mudron, a great illustrator, a friend of mine. And it kind of pulls together, just like an image of everything in the book, like every game. There's even a hamburger for burger time in there. So there's that poster, and then I reached out to some of the people who contribute cover art to the Retronauts podcast and commissioned them to recreate box art for some of the most iconic NES games from 1987. And so I did draw a recreation, like a kind of stylized reimagining of the Metroid box art. But the other 7 pieces are by other artists like John Pading, Sean Kahn, Amanda Pruitt, and they vary in style. Like Sean Kahn's art is very painterly almost. It's very detailed and has a lot of brush effects on it. Just a very dynamic, exciting. He's a very talented professional artist. And then you have Amanda Pruitt's rendition of Lode Runner, which is very clean, stylized, cartoonish. She does children's book illustrations, and so it just has a totally different feel. But all 8 artists who contributed the 6x8 prints all kind of took their own approach, and some of them were very liberal or very faithful in their interpretations of the NES box art. Some of them were very imaginative. So it's just kind of a fun extra that's included in there. But that's really the only place you'll see any of my drawings. Oh no, actually, I'm wrong. A few years back, I put together a hand-illustrated map of the Metroid, the game map for Metroid, and turned that into a poster. And I did take a photo of that and just included it as a page to itself. But it's not really the point of anything. It's just, hey, here's like a drawing of the Metroid map. So that's about it.
So switching gears, talking about Mega Man, it was one of the more difficult games franchises released on the NES. Can you talk about how video game difficulty evolved from the arcade to the living room during the NES era? These felt more like some of the games were impossible to beat without calling a tips line or buying a strategy guide at the time.
Yeah, so there's a couple different lines of difficulty when you look at NES games. Some of them are based around being really, really hard tests of dexterity, and some of them are based around being very, very esoteric tests of intuition and discovery. So on one hand, you have like Deadly Towers, which is a game that actually that's kind of hard and doesn't make any sense. But yeah, Mega Man was very much in that arcade lineage. And, you know, it came from Capcom, who started making arcade games, and most of their games to that point had been arcade conversions. Mega Man was one of their first major creations specifically for a console. And their arcade ethos, I think, kind of bled through into that. And, you know, if you look at Mega Man 2, it makes a lot of changes. It takes away the scoring system. It doesn't have a score. It gives you the ability to refill Mega Man's health. It gives you passwords to save your progress. The first Mega Man doesn't have any of that. It's a smaller game, but yeah, it's ferociously difficult. It's one that I owned back in the day, and, you know, back in the day where I only had a few games at a time. So if I had a game, I was going to play it, and I was going to get good at it whether I wanted to or not. I think Mega Man is actually a game that I think Mega Man is a game that is actually one that offers a compelling reason to get good, because it's really well designed. It's you know, it was kind of overseen to some degree by Tokaru Fujiwara, who is famous for Ghost and Goblins and Bionic Commando and a bunch of other really, really challenging arcade games. But also at the same time, one of its lead designers was Akira Kitamura, who has written about kind of the design philosophy he explores with this game, which is to kind of build up difficulty and then taper it off a little bit so players get a little bit of relief, and then spike it up again to get really hard, kind of like for a, you know, that final flourish. And if you play Mega Man, you really feel that. There's moments where, you know, it starts out, it gets challenging, it gets harder, and then you have a breather. You know, there's like a screen with almost no enemies on it, or you just have to do like a simple jumping challenge. But then, you know, you're right back in the thick of it, and eventually that leads you to the boss. Then you have to, you know, face off against the boss. So, you know, they were still figuring things out to a certain degree in 1987. But Mega Man, I think, you know, is the last game released in 1987 for NES, and really does feel like the culmination of a lot of different streams of game design and philosophy to that point. And it's not perfect, but I think it was overlooked because of the terrible box art in the US. But, you know, those of us who played it discovered, oh, there's actually something really good here. And, you know, they built on that and improved on that with Mega Man 2 and its sequels. But, you know, there was a great start right there with that game.
Why are books based off the history of video games so important?
The video games industry is not good at telling its own story and recording its own history. I told you, like, I asked Sega, hey, when did these SG-1000 games actually ship? And they said 1984. And that's you know, that's the info they have in-house. Game studios don't do a great job of republishing their old games either to keep them in circulation. You know, if a game has cachet, if they say, oh, we're going to make some money off of this, then sure, they'll put out an emulation collection or, you know, a mini console or something. But for the most part, 99% of these games, if you want to play them, you just have to go back and find them. You have to play them on their original cartridge or diskette. And, you know, that's difficult and, you know, gets into some legally gray areas. So having a book, I think, or, you know, videos or podcasts or whatever, like some sort of media that records and it explains, you know, not only what these games were, like anyone can play a game and experience, you know, the basic experience of the game on an emulator, but to understand, you know, who made these games, like why does this game play the way it does? What were the influences on this game? What influences did this game exert on other games? Those are, you know, more nebulous questions that you don't necessarily get just by booting up a ROM on an emulator. So I think there's value in documenting that and making it more readily available to people who either were there and forgot, or want to relive those memories, or more likely people who weren't there and don't really know this stuff. They didn't experience it firsthand, so they don't have that context. And also there's a lot of disinformation about games, not necessarily deliberately, but people's memory, who were involved with games, it slips over time. They forget things. They mix up their stories. So, anytime you can draw from multiple sources and kind of center in on what is probably the actual course of events and the actual story for a game, that's great. So yeah, the more information I think is out there about game history, the better understanding we have of what that background is, and how we got to the point where we are now, and why games work the way they do today.
What do you believe is the primary purpose that careful curation of video game history serves in a modern game industry? Does it go beyond nostalgia and respect for the things that came before?
Well, it definitely goes beyond nostalgia. I mean, if you want nostalgia, you can just, watch a quick video of like game references or something and say, oh yeah, that's great. But yeah, like, again, understanding how these games came to be, why their design works the way it does, I think those are harder to pin down. And so it's valuable when people do the heavy lifting to kind of figure these things out, to go and talk to developers and hunt down people whose story hasn't been told, or just to sit down and look at a game and really try to understand it, not just to say, oh, this game really sucks. Like Deadly Towers, I don't understand it, it's stupid and bad. I mean, yeah, Deadly Towers is bad, but why is it bad? Like, how did it end up being bad the way that it is? I think there's a lot of value in actually trying to understand, what were the developers trying to do here? Because no one sits down and says, I'm going to make a really bad video game. I think that would be great. That would really be my legacy for history. No, everyone who sits down and makes a video game, unless it's a workaday job, which, there's some of that. But the people who sit down and do something that just turns out to be a disastrous, they usually, it usually ends up that way because they have great ideas, but maybe they don't have the right team or the right talent or the right kind of approach to game design to really realize those thoughts. But that doesn't mean you should just immediately say, this game is trash, this is stupid, it has no value. I think there's a lot of value in saying, like, how did it end up like this? And, to go back to some of these somewhat questionable games and try to, trace the thread of inspiration and try to understand what it could have been. And maybe no one's ever been able to really realize that ambition. Maybe that's something that future game designers could do, to say, oh, I recognize a spark of inspiration here. I recognize ambition that was not realized, but I see what they were doing, and I'd love to try, to take a swing at it myself and, like, vindicate this designer from 30 years ago and realize their dream for them. And maybe that's, I don't know, maybe no one actually does that, but there's lots of kind of bad old games that are bad in a well-meaning way. And I find those really interesting, not necessarily enjoyable to play, but I like to tell their stories, and I like to try to unravel the mess and, see, like, are there other games that try to do this and actually pulled it off? So I guess, like, for me, that's kind of the angle that I approach things from. But other historians and other writers have different angles as well.
You say that, and immediately LJN comes to mind, the publisher who's infamous in the 80s, who were just trying to just capitalize, because the return policy wasn't as gracious as one now. If you bought a game and it was a bad game, SOL, sorry. That was $80, out of your pocket in 1987 and 88. Sorry, like, that's crazy. Yeah, but they have like you said, they have a story too,
Yeah, no, LJN made their debut on NES in 1987, and I started reading about those games and digging into them, and they're mostly not good, but they're interesting. Like Gotcha, the Lycan game, ties in with kind of LJN's entire existence. And then Jaws, which is kind of infamous for being weird and bad. Like, that's made by the people who made Wonder Boy, and they made it in like 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And they were trying to create like a role-playing style adventure action game based around Jaws, but they had no resources. They had no time to do it. But like, something I've talked about here at the office is, like, if we ever landed the Jaws license, I'd love to go and work with the people who used to be at Westone and sit down with them and say, hey, we're going to give you, $500,000. Remake Jaws. Do it the way you envisioned. We know there's a great idea here. We can tell. Now it's time for you to realize that. I mean, that's, pie in the sky. That's ridiculous. But money and licensing rights and things like that weren't an issue, which they always are, especially with a game like that. Like, that would be really cool to do because, yeah, again, 1987 was full of great NES games and also not so great NES games that really, they were punching above their weight class. They didn't just want to be another arcade game. They wanted, their designers wanted to create something bigger and more impressive. They were inspired by Zelda or games like, Wizardry or Dragon Slayer or Portopia or Super Mario Brothers, and said, oh yeah, these are amazing. We can do something on this level. And then they didn't quite pull it off. But the inspiration was there. That's, that's one of the fascinating things about the 8-bit era for me, is just that sense of developers who said anything is possible now. Video games are powerful and cool and new, and we're going to go for it. And sometimes they fell flat on their faces, but so often they were really trying. Oh yeah, the book is available now at Limited Run Games. It just launched. We still have a decent number of the collector's edition limited copies in, and quite a few of the hardcover copies. A few months from now, I think you'll be able to buy a paperback edition on Amazon. The paperback edition doesn't have as much content in it as the hardcover. The hardcover has an entire bonus section on things like the Famicom Disk System. It has in a big article comparing all the different versions of the original Castlevania that showed up on different systems, like the arcade game, the MSX game, the X68000 game that was on PlayStation. It's got a piece on the original Goonies. It's got a piece on the game Elite, which inspired Star Voyager, which was a 1987 release. So there's a lot of extra kind of supplemental content that, it's not part of the 1987 chronology. But I think if you're interested in kind of understanding these games and really getting a sense of what 1987 on NES was about, yeah, I think it's good to have that extra info.